Blood mist, a sea of blood. All he saw was blood. A maroon moon shone in the sky. The sky was covered with a dark color. Weapons were scattered everywhere, axes, and more. Not far from them was a red flag covered in blood with a symbol painted on it in white. The man standing in the middle of it was looking at the hands in front of him. They were covered in blood. In my mind's eye, I saw an image of a warrior dressed in armor lying on the ground near death and stretching out his hand, telling me to run away. A comrade in arms. In the next moment, it's the back of another man with a gun in his hand and heavy armor who says that nothing can destroy the human race, they will still survive and be saved. He was pierced by a sword and many arrows. At the end, he was the only one left, a man standing in the middle of a field, a lot of dead bodies lying everywhere. He had long black hair and a red robe on his body. He dropped to one knee. In front of him was a huge array of monsters and enemies. The crowd of undead was armed with armor and weapons. There was a dragon in the sky with its mouth open, showing many sharp teeth in its mouth, and not far from it was another creature. It had 2 pairs of wings and a third eye in its forehead, with huge horns on its head. The creature spoke to the robed man. He said that was he, the great god of the human race, as others called him. After all, he didn't even know martial arts, and all he could do was hide behind a pile of trash. It was Ember, the heavenly demon emperor. He had red eyes and a creepy smile with sharp teeth. He pointed a clawed finger at the man and said that he would never defeat him. The demon called the person in front of him the pill god, Qin Feng, zero in martial arts. Qin Feng had a grimace of anger on his face. Large drops of tears rolled down his cheeks, and a wry smile appeared on his lips. He lost heart and said that everything was in vain. He, Qin Feng, the god of pills, had lived a long good life, as long as 100,000 years, and during all this time, he hadn't even understood the most basic concept of the topic of martial arts. He could only look at his martial comrades helplessly and continue to fight. Qin Feng stood there alone in the middle of a bloody field. With a frown on his face, he took out a pill from his bosom and swallowed it. A fiery light enveloped him, and he took up a fighting stance. Qin Feng extended his hand in front of him, leaving 2 fingers. He was ready to charge into battle. Qin Feng ran towards the crowd of monsters that were rushing towards him. Today, he, Qin Feng, would fight these demons to the very end. The man clenched his hand into a fist, swinging it close to the demon Emperor Ember's face. A second later, a huge spear pierced through his stomach, passing through his body. He immediately hung in midair. His arms hung limply, dripping blood. He thought that this was the end. In this life, he possessed a useless body, was able to reach the very pinnacle of alchemy, yet his body was unable to cultivate. Qin Feng thought that he was actually a good-for-nothing weakling, and if he had the chance to be reborn, he would definitely master martial arts to perfection. He would correct those mistakes no matter what, against the heavens. Qin Feng was lying on the ground, blood dripping from his face. The round green-colored amulet hanging around his neck was cracked and covered in cracks. The next moment, he woke up in the shack. Qin Feng was lying on the bed, suddenly jumping up on the spot. The room was littered with various utensils, books were scattered around, pictures were nearby, and a cabinet stood next to his bed. He clutched at his bandaged chest and wondered where he was at all. Qin Feng picked up the amulet hanging around his neck, and it was as good as new. There wasn't a single crack on it. He clutched his head, the memories starting to come back to him one by one. He remembered lying dying on the battlefield, the woman with long pink hair and a smile on her face, his other comrades. Qin Feng remembered that he had been reborn. He continued to hold his head, burying his face in his hair. He recalled the very moment when Lin Shuven made it so that he could no longer master martial arts, exactly 100,000 years ago. Qin Feng stood on the battlefield covered in blood, leaning on his shoulder. There were traces of blood everywhere on his body. He spoke to Lin Shuven and talked about how he had won the competition. She was his fiancée, so why did you try to kill him? A girl with pink hair stood in front of him and replied that she had entered into a marriage contract with him 3 years ago only to temporarily join his Qin family. She had ascended to the 3rd step. Lin Shuven cupped Qin Feng's face, lifting his head and forcing him to look at her. She added with a smile that did someone like him really think he was worthy of her. Qin Feng stared at her in shock. Qin Feng sat down in the lotus position. A golden light enveloped him. In his past life, his martial arts were exhausted, and he had no choice but to focus on alchemy. Even though he had reached his peak in alchemy, it still wasn't enough. Qin Feng clenched his hand into a fist. If he could practice martial arts, the tragedy of the demon clan's invasion of the Shenki continent in his past life wouldn't have happened. And if he fixes everything, the human race will not perish. Qin Feng held the green amulet in his hands and looked at it. Thanks to this jade pendant, he had a chance to start over. Qin Feng draped a green kimono over his shoulders, pulling it on. Great, if he focused on getting stronger, whether it was alchemy or martial arts, then he would have to deal with everything, and he would definitely reach the top. Qin Feng recalled all of his enemies and rivals, ready to face them. He clenched his hand tightly into a fist with a smile on his face. Qin Feng was dressed in his usual clothes, his long hair pulled back in a high ponytail. As the doors opened, a strange man ran in. He addressed Qin Feng young master and said that their business was bad. Qin Feng asked what had happened and what was the matter. The man looked worried, with a brown ponytail pulled back in a bun and purple eyes. He pointed into the distance and said that Lin Lang, the eldest son of the Lin family, had barged into the medical garden and said that he wanted to see Qin Feng immediately. The excited man was Qin Sanghu, and he was the commander of the Qin family's medical garden guards. Lin Xuven's brother, Lin Lan. Qin Feng remembered this moment in his past life. He came to ask for the management of the medical garden and took the opportunity to humiliate him. A tall man with silver hair was pointing at Qin Feng with a folded fan. Under his pressure, he had to agree, and then in a hurry to leave the family and lie low for 10 years. The Lin family, in his opinion, it wasn't a family, but a nest of rats and snakes. Qin Feng clenched his hand into a fist, walking heavily towards the sudden guest. He told Qin Sanghu to take him to see Brother Lin. The employee immediately became agitated, trying to stop Qin Feng and telling the young master that Lin Lan had a sharp and sarcastic tongue, and that it was better for him to deal with him himself than for Qin Feng to do so. However, Qin Feng replied that it was fine and he would deal with it himself. Lin Lang unceremoniously called Qin Feng loudly, familiarly addressing him as Qin. He was shouting out when he was going to come out and whether he was going to come out or not, and Lin would have told him to hurry because he was too eager to get the medical garden. The medical garden was located on a mountain hill, surrounded by trees and other bright greenery. Lin Lan was Lin Xuven's brother and was a top-notch alchemist. The young man was standing with a fan, fanning himself. His silvery long hair was flowing, and his eyes were green in color. He had a satisfied smile on his face. He continued to talk to Qin Feng, telling him that Lin Xuven, his sister, had made significant progress in the field of martial arts, and if he didn't give him the garden right away, then Qin Feng wouldn't be satisfied. He added that it was better for him to be reasonable, otherwise at some point it would be too late to kneel down and beg him for mercy. Qin Feng came out to meet him with a smile on his face and replied that he, the older brother, was hiding behind his younger sister and wasn't he ashamed to brag so brazenly at all. Did he have sister syndrome? Lin Lan's face reflected the shock of such audacity and his words that for a second he was taken aback. Qin Feng went on to say that according to the prenuptial agreement, this medical garden was supposed to go to his Lin family, but now that the prenuptial agreement was terminated, and by the way, by themselves, they came back for what they themselves refused. Qin Feng grimaced as he looked down at the man and added ironically that it was somehow wrong. Lin Lan was so angry at his words that his face turned purple and his entire body trembled. Nearby, the workers chuckled softly in the background. Lin Lan thought about the reason why Qin Feng was being so sarcastic today. Lin Xuven covered himself with a fan and replied with a nervous smile that Qin Feng wasn't as good as their other family members. Plus, Qin Feng was injured in the competition, and if his younger sister hadn't shown mercy and entered into a prenuptial agreement with him, he would have been killed long ago. How could he, Qin Feng, remain ungrateful to the Xuven family after such an action? Qin Feng waved away the fan pointed in his direction in disgust and replied that even here, Lin Lang had managed to attribute his younger sister and he really should have a brotherly complex, shouldn't he? Lin Lan's fan trembled in anger and he held it tightly in his outstretched hand. The guards flanking Qin Feng pulled out their spears from their backs and pointed them at the man in front of him. Qin Feng said that it looked like the Qin family guards had something to do. Lin Lan's face looked agitated and tense, clearly not expecting how things would turn out. The man thought that Qin Feng's behavior was quite strange. In his memory, Qin Feng had always been pliable and calm, so why was he so difficult to deal with today? Lin Lang smiled maliciously and told the man to expect a response to such an act very soon. He asked if Qin Feng remembered that there was only 1 month left before the alchemist competition. Qin Feng yawned in response to his words, covering his mouth with his hand and asked what's the big deal. Lin Lang asked if he had the guts to make a bet with him, and if Qin Feng could pick up this year's award, then he would be willing to give him their iron family mine. However, if he lost, then this beautiful garden was at his disposal. The man suggested that he make a similar bet. Behind Qin Feng, Qin Sanghu chuckled softly into his fist and thought about how Lin still wanted their medicine garden. After all, their young master was not stupid at all, and anyone with even a little bit of intelligence would not agree to such a bet. However, Qin Feng did not live up to the expectations of his worker and replied that he agreed. It's a deal, and even offered as an option to conclude a written agreement and sign it for both of them. Qin Sanghu opened his eyes wide, not believing what he had just heard. He didn't understand why the young master agreed. Even Lin Lang was a little shocked, but he still agreed and added that Qin Feng should not regret what he had done in the future. A paper of agreement between Qin Feng and Lin Lang was brought to them, on which it was written that if he was defeated, Qin Feng would hand over the medical garden to Lin Lang, and if Lin Lang was defeated, he would hand over the Iron Family mine to Qin Feng. There were 2 seals on the paper, and the clerk recorded their agreement. Lin Lang thought that he shouldn't have been so nervous at first, because in his opinion, Qin Feng was still a fool. The man smiled smugly at Qin Feng as he prepared to walk away. He told Qin Feng that the medical garden was not something that a stupid and wasteful young master should be responsible for. Lin Lang turned around, walking away from the Qin Feng land. Behind the man, Qin Sengku placed his forehead on his palm and thought that it was all over now. Lin Lang laughed out loud and told Qin Feng that when the time came, the man didn't even dare to beg for mercy. Qin Sengku turned away and tragically put the back of his hand to his forehead, lamenting that now the Qin family's blood was also finished. In his opinion, even though the young master was already of age, he was still such a big kid. Qin Feng turned to him with a smile on his lips, the smile of a child who was 100,000 years old, and asked what he had just heard, and said that when the time came, that scoundrel, Lin Lang, would kneel in front of him. A little later, Qin Feng sat on the bed in the lotus position and meditated. A golden light enveloped him, his hands rested at his sides on his crossed legs, and his eyes were closed. Qin Feng took deep breaths. Suddenly, he coughed sharply, and a clot of blood flew out of his mouth. Qin Feng caught his breath and wiped the blood from his mouth with the back of his sleeve with a smirk. He thought that even though his strength had dropped to the level of Kai and blood, he still had some perspective. But thanks to the improvement of the magic technique, he solved the loss of Kai and blood. A warrior has 6 realms: Kai and blood realm the weakest, tempering medium realm, main realm, void realm, false god realm, demigod realm. Each realm was divided into 9 levels. In his previous life, he had lost his cultivation base because he was attacked by Lin Xuven, and he had not been able to practice martial arts since then. Fortunately, he had now maintained his cultivation base with the transformation of gods technique, and thanks to it, he had saved his foundation for mastering martial arts. Transfiguration of the gods is a special technique that he discovered in his previous life. The effect was that there was an increase in perception by all 6 senses. This technique might seem mediocre, but everyone who had practiced transfiguration of the gods in his previous life had become popular and successful figures. It was then that he discovered that there was an incredible power hidden in this special technique. Even though he couldn't practice martial arts in his previous life, he still kept the technique in mind. Who would have thought that one day it would be useful to him? Qin Feng was clenching his hand into a fist, which was emitting a bright yellow light. He was suddenly interrupted. Qin Sengku burst into the room, calling out to the young master and waving his hands in alarm. They moved to the Qin family's medicine garden. There were guards outside, and Qin Feng was bent over the piles of grass that were neatly arranged in equal piles, and Qin Feng was looking at them. The worker next to him spoke to him and said that news had just arrived that the medicine collection time had been moved half a month ahead of schedule, and that the collector would arrive in 10 days. Qin Feng was holding a withered grass in his hands. For some unknown reason, all the grass was wilted. Even if they are given all the necessary conditions to grow herbs, they will definitely not be able to pass everything in time. The worker was in a bit of a commotion because of the whole situation. Qin Feng asked the man if he was so sure of his words. The young master got to his feet, preparing to perform some incantation. A bright light enveloped him, and the air around him soared up. Qin Feng activated transformation, 6 senses. He could see through the withered grass that there was something else under it, under each pile. He couldn't believe it, because it turned out to be a lian weed, and it was hidden under all this dense vegetation. How could such a harmful herb appear in the medical garden? Now, it was no wonder that all their grass had wilted. From the looks of it, Lin Lan was the one who planted this lian here. Qin Feng picked up the green grass. Now it was clear why he dared to make a bet. Qin Feng thought that it was now clear why he had decided to offer a bet. Obviously, Lin Lang wanted to deliberately ruin everything during his absence. Qin Feng smiled while looking at his hand. It was a wonderful gift from a man. 10 days later, Lin Lang was walking with an escort. Along the road, many servants were walking behind him, and one strong guy was riding on top of a horse. Lin Lang covered himself with a fan and said that the King family could meet the herb collector. He asked where Qin Feng was. The herb collector arrived, and he didn't even come out to greet him. The poor worker knelt on one knee and held out his hands in greeting, shivering under the shadow of the burly man who accompanied Lin Lang. He told them to wait just a couple of minutes, and their young master would be arriving any minute. Qin Feng came out and asked what the commotion was at such an hour and who had come to see them so early in the morning. Even before the roosters woke up, they were already there. Qin Feng was wearing a straw hat, and he pulled it slightly forward with a smile on his face. Lin Lang said with a sarcastic smile Did everyone see how Qin Feng didn't even kneel in front of the herb collector in greeting? Plus he was trying to be sarcastic. This was the height of disrespect. The formidable man on the horse frowned, the veins on his face bulging. This was the medicinal herb collector of the main branch of the Qin family, Qin Yulan. He demanded that Qin Feng immediately kneel down. The startled worker immediately fell to his knees, clasped his hands in a prayer gesture, and begged Qin Yulan not to get angry. The guards behind him followed suit. Qin Senku squinted at the young master and addressed him, telling him to apologize to the herb collector and kneel down. The last time they angered the herb collector, their medical garden was fined triple the amount. Qin Feng, meanwhile, stood still and didn't even move. He was holding in his mouth the same stalk of grass that had been put in their harvest. Qin Feng raised his gaze and gave them the middle finger with a cheeky smile, sending them off to hell. Lin Lan and Qin Yulan were shocked by this response. The herb collector frowned and bared his teeth, and Lin Lan's face simply showed a lack of understanding of what had just happened. Qin Senku just stared at the young master with wide eyes. Qin Feng grinned as he continued to talk about how the man was just a simple herb collector, and did he really think that he had any official powers? Qin Feng added that he was just a spoiled chicken, and why should he kneel in front of him? Qin Senku, who was standing nearby, clutched his head, turning paler with each word. Qin Yulan flushed, and it was as if the sky had turned a maroon color from his anger. He pointed his finger at Qin Feng and replied, how dare he treat him like this? And why would Qin Feng be so presumptuous as to even prepare medicinal herbs? Qin Feng pointed his hand to the side and replied with a straight face, according to the practice of the past years, there are a lot of herbs and all of them were already prepared for him. Qin Yulan smiled viciously and reached for the weapon on his back. He replied that it had nothing to do with the practice of previous years, and who said that this year is similar to the previous ones. Didn't Qin Feng know that the standard for obtaining medicines was tripled this year? Right now, his behavior had doubled it even further, and if Qin Feng couldn't pay the ration today, he would lose his head. Qin Yulan took out a huge sword from his back, pointing the point at the man. Qin Feng didn't move, remaining completely calm as Qin Senku grew more terrified by the second. Qin Senku thought that they wouldn't even be able to collect a double rate. What kind of triple rate could they possibly be talking about? In addition, it was also multiplied by 2. Qin Senku thought that things were really bad for them, and now not only would they lose the medical garden to Lin Lan, but they would also lose young Qin Feng's life. Lin Lang was standing to the side, smiling evilly behind his fan. He had specially cajoled Qin Yulan beforehand, arranging for him to have a luxurious vacation right at his Lin Lang residence. If Qin Feng lost their bet, then he and Qin Yulan would split the medical garden 50-50. Lin Lang had made a deal with the man beforehand while they were drinking alcohol and eating delicious food. Under these conditions, Qin Yulan of course agreed. Lin Lang also hired a spy, and he reported to him that there was only one Qin Feng working in the medical garden all this time. And what effective tricks could he come up with under such conditions, especially for someone who doesn't know anything about herbs? Qin Feng smiled as he covered his eyes with his hat. Triple standard in double volume. Qin Feng ordered them to follow him. Lin Lan and Qin Yulan watched him go in disbelief. Lin Lang continued to smile conspiratorially while Qin Yulan frowned and got angry at Qin Feng's insolence. As Lin Lang followed behind Qin Feng, he noticed the tufts of dried grass that were located behind the fence of the wooden bridge. He laughed viciously, clutching his head. And these were the herbs Qin Feng had planted in his famous medical garden. The herb collector immediately frowned and glared at the young master. How was this supposed to be understood by Qin Feng? Trying to fool the main clan. How audacious. Both men pointed their weapons at Qin Feng. Qin Yulan said that for the sake of the Qin family, he would carry out an execution for the main clan and rid the clan of him, the scum. Qin Feng used his fingers to push away the blade that was pointing at him. He just grinned and said that, as expected, scum only sees trash, and they don't pay any attention to the main treasure. Qin Feng shouted loudly for them to take a closer look at the garden. All over the garden were planted beds, there were a whole lot of them. A huge amount of fresh green grass bloomed all over the garden. Everyone following Qin Feng, Lin Lan, Qin Yulan, and Qin Senku was taken aback, not understanding what was going on at all. Instead of dried grass, they saw many blooming fruits and flowers. No one knew what had happened. Lin Lan's eyes widened, and his eyes were bloodshot. He didn't understand how this could have happened. Did Qin Feng know anything about taking care of medicinal herbs? How was he able to take such good care of all this huge pile of grass? Plus, the lean grass that he planted everywhere. He'd seen with his own eyes that she was still there. Qin Yulan fell to the ground in shock, his mouth hanging open. The color of this grass was good enough, and it was all top-notch. Its quality exceeded all standards. Qin Yulan also noted that from the looks of it, there was even 5 times the required amount of grass, if not more. Qin Feng was smiling triumphantly with his arms crossed. Qin Sanku hovered around him, elated and amazed by what he saw. He put his hands to his cheeks. So this was what the young master had been doing all these days. He did his best to take care of the medical garden. Lin Lang immediately burst into a shout, flashing and pointing at him. He asked Qin Feng, how was this even possible? How did he, Qin Feng, even manage to do such a thing? Qin Feng took off his hat and only chuckled at the man's words in response. Liang grass is a terrible weed by nature, and planting it in medicinal plants naturally causes them to wither. However, in this era, no one knows that if you plant Liang grass from the reverse side of the sun and give it some transformations, it will change its properties and accelerate the growth and quality of medicinal plants. Qin Feng ran around with the Liang grass, planting and tending it, feeding it with magic. Qin Feng walked up to Lin Lan and smiled maliciously as he looked down at him. He said he shouldn't care how he did it at all. All that mattered was that he had lost their argument. And according to their argument, he seems to have promised him an iron mine. Lin Lan gritted his teeth. The next thing he knew, he was laughing and glaring furiously at the man, telling him that he wasn't going to give him anything, and what could he do? Qin Feng took out the contract and displayed it right in front of the man's eyes with a satisfied smile on his face. The contract clearly outlined the terms of their dispute and transaction. Qin Feng started to tease him and ask him, what is it in his hands? Is it some important piece of paper? It said that if he didn't give it up, he would go to prison for the rest of his life. Lin Lan shuddered. He had completely forgotten that he had signed this paper and that he should not have done it in principle. Lin Lan looked at Qin Yulan helplessly, but Qin Yulan only waved him off guiltily with a nervous smile and said that it had nothing to do with his bet and he was just passing by. It was clear that Lin Lan had lost. Everyone disowned him. He couldn't take such a hard attack. In the end, the iron mine still ended up in Qin Feng's hands. It was a huge mine located in a rocky area. Above the mountains was a light blue sky. Qin Feng was making his way into it with his companions. He introduced the mine to his workers and said that the mine was given to them by Lin Lan. The other guys were delighted with this. Qin Sanku told the young master that he had obtained an entire iron mine, but he still didn't understand something. Why would he risk a precious medical garden for a worthless iron ore? Was this really some kind of plan? Qin Feng replied with a good-natured smile that there was actually no plan, and he just got a little overreacted and said too much back then. Qin Sanku was left stunned by this calmness and what had happened in the first place. He stared at the master with his mouth open. In fact, the ratio of iron ore to elixir wasn't even worth estimating at all. But from his past life, he remembered that this iron mine wasn't easy. It actually contained a lot of valuable, mysterious iron ore. If the mine was used for its intended purpose, then its cost was not lower than the cost of a medical garden. Suddenly, a man in armor ran out to meet Qin Feng. He pointed his finger in the direction of the spring and shouted that something had happened in the mine. Qin Feng immediately frowned seriously. The man who ran out added that the mine suddenly collapsed, and dozens of miners were crushed to death. Qin Sanku exclaimed in disbelief. They were outside the mines near the collapse. The mines were completely filled up with huge blocks. The people who had lost their relatives a moment ago rushed to the entrance of the mine. One woman was rushing forward and calling for her son. Qin Feng frowned, deep in thought. Qin Sanku stood nearby and panicked. He held his head and talked about why they destroyed the mine as soon as they got it. God probably hates them. The mining family furiously started pointing their finger at Qin Feng and saying that it was all because of the Qin family, and if it wasn't for them, nothing would have happened. People rushed towards him. Some of them would call out to Qin Feng and shout that as long as their iron mine was owned by the Lin family, they would always be safe, but as soon as the Qin Feng family came, things went really bad. The guards tried to hold the people back with their spears, blocking the way to Qin Feng so that they wouldn't tear them to pieces. They believed that the Qin family had angered the mountain god and that was why he had brought down a landslide on them. People were accusing him, shouting in his face and demanding that he return their relatives who had just died. One was shouting for him to give him back his son, the other was shouting for him to give him back his father. Qin Sanku became worried and stood behind his master, telling him in a low voice that it was too dangerous here and they had better get out of here quickly. However, Qin Feng refused outright. His brow furrowed. As soon as the mine came into his possession, there was a landslide, which was too much of a coincidence. Qin Feng activated the interstate sensing skill. He was trying to figure out what was going on inside the mine. He saw many people lying on the ground and covered with rocks. He could feel their heartbeats. Fortunately, the miners inside weren't dead, they were still alive. And judging by the tracks, it looked like it wasn't a complete collapse of the mine. Just a landslide, which fortunately blocked only the entrance to the cave itself. It was obvious that it was made by hands. A man-made explosion. Qin Feng took a closer look. At this rate, he understood what was going on. He felt the eyes on him. Lin Lan watched. After Qin Feng won their bet, he deliberately blew up the mine. By killing the miners, he wanted to provoke the public's anger and turn it against Qin Feng. He had no regard for human lives. Qin Feng was infuriated by this. He ordered everyone to be quiet and said they needed to listen to him. Qin Feng told the crowd that the miners inside were still alive. Qin Feng stood on a mountain fragment, addressing the crowd from below. He said that if they removed the stones at the entrance, they could save them. It was better to act right now. This was the best time to save. They all needed to start together. However, people didn't really believe him. A man in the crowd shouted back with tears in his eyes that no, the mine had collapsed, and how anyone inside could possibly have survived at all. He sent Qin Feng to hell. Another woman added that how dare he even lie to them in such a situation. Lin Lang only laughed loudly from afar as he watched the entire situation. He poked his finger and talked about how cleverly he had thought of everything, and that Qin Feng obviously wanted to die at the hands of these workers. Next to him, a white-haired old man with a long beard was nodding along and talking about how really, what a stupid person Qin Feng was. People rushed towards Qin Feng, wanting to tear him apart. They had already begun to slowly break through the crowd, Qin Sangku and the guards barely managing to contain the angry crowd. Qin Sangku shouted at the young master to immediately run away from here, otherwise this angry crowd would definitely finish him off. Qin Feng frowned and looked down at the floor, thinking for a few seconds. Qin Feng turned to his guards and told the Qin family to immediately stop resisting and lay down their weapons. Qin Sangku turned to look at him, not understanding what Qin Feng was up to. Qin Feng ordered the guards to lay down their weapons. The crowd stared at him with tears in their eyes. There were young women, elderly people, small children, people of completely different colors. Qin Feng addressed them once more, trying to reach out this time. He said that, dear people, what if their loved ones still had some chance of salvation? Did they really want to give up? Qin Feng raised up his sword, shouting loudly to the people. He continued, saying that he, Qin Feng, was swearing on his life that he would definitely save them. But if they dig up the mine and find that all the people inside are dead, then they can do whatever they want with it. Qin Feng walked down the mountain towards the crowd. He held out his weapon to them, asking them if they would agree to such a condition. Qin Feng's gaze was frowning, showing the seriousness of his intentions. The people in the crowd fell silent, looking at each other. They were silent for a moment. Qin Sangku clung to the young master's legs and began to sob about how it was wrong. Meanwhile, people continued to talk, wondering whether to believe his words or not. One of the men asked the young woman if it was worth it, and she said yes, and if there was a chance that her husband might still be alive, then it was worth at least trying. They all unanimously decided that they would rush to save everyone. The workers, along with the Qin family guards, rushed to the rubble at the entrance of the mine. They decided that they would all help each other out together. Someone shouted that he would work with a shovel, and someone said that he would move stones. Someone rushed to help move the stones. Qin Feng turned to Sangku and said that he would need to go back and do some things for him. Qin Feng purposely spoke extremely softly so that no one else would be able to hear his words. Qin Sangku himself didn't understand why the young master had asked him to do it so quietly. Had he lost his mind? Lin Lang continued to watch the entire scene nearby, chuckling and grinning evilly. He laughed and said that they could dig as much as they liked, but they wouldn't be able to do anything in the end. He had already placed swamp miasma in the mine long ago, a terrible thing. Even if the people inside weren't crushed to death, they would definitely all die from the toxins. Qin Feng, he once again said such big words directly in public. He won't be able to fulfill his promise and will definitely be killed. 2 hours later, there were two people standing on the cliff and they were happily shouting about what they had finally managed to dig. The woman standing over Prokop started shouting into the hole and calling for the head, and the man next to her tried to call his son. As they made their way deeper into the cave, they saw many unconscious male bodies. The woman immediately burst into tears and started blaming Qin Feng, saying that he was a liar and all the people inside the cave were dead. It was all because of Qin Feng, as they believed. Lin Lan followed with his entourage. He quipped that didn't Qin Feng say that they could do whatever they wanted to him if the people inside were dead. He added, deliberately taunting people, that Qin Feng didn't fulfill his promise even though he swore on his life. So Qin Feng must give up this life. The angry crowd immediately went berserk. They were bribed by Lin Lan's words. One of the men agreed with him and said that he was right and Qin Feng should say goodbye to his life. Others armed themselves with various devices and shouted that Qin Feng should have died. Lin Lan smiled viciously as he looked in Qin Feng's direction. He laughed and said that he was well aware that Qin Feng clearly suspected him of the incident, but he didn't have any proof, and even if he tried to dig up something, it still wouldn't work. Lin Lan mockingly pointed out that Qin Feng must have been insanely scared, so he could have been scared in front of everyone and run back home. He wanted to save his own skin, right? Qin Feng called the man over. Lin Lan stared at him in disbelief. Why was he so calm? No, Qin Feng didn't even think about running away, And why did Qin Feng go to the bodies? Qin Feng took a tomato from the proffered basket and started chewing on it, ordering the others to do the same. He told Qin Sanku to stuff the previously chewed peel into their mouths, and I hurried on with it, and to avoid getting the medicine dirty, he could stuff it mouth to mouth. Qin Zinku stared at Qin Feng in horror as he bent over the huge bearded man. Although he obviously didn't look particularly thrilled, he obeyed him and agreed. He pressed his lips to the man's beneath him. Lin Lan didn't understand what was going on. He thought that Qin Feng had gone mad and was deliberately bullying the corpses to vent his anger on them. Lin Lang pointed a finger in Qin Feng's direction with a malicious smile and told the family members to pay attention to how Qin Feng was mocking the bodies of dead people they once knew. An even crazier crowd started shouting that they would kill him, leave the body here, and they would make sure to seal the entrance. They ordered everyone to run forward directly at Qin Feng. People chanted and shouted that they would kill this man, and how dare he insult their family members in such a way. Qin Feng remained calm and ordered Sanku not to be afraid and continued doing what he was doing. Qin Feng continued shoving the chewed rind into the mouths of the bodies. Qin Sanku, with tears in his eyes and a mouth full of tomatoes, asked the young master if they were increasing the chances of being finished off already, and even more so, he gave the man lying under him his first kiss. From afar, men could already be seen rushing towards them. The man lying next to Sanku opened one eye. He jumped up abruptly and started talking about how he hadn't noticed that he had overslept, and he seemed to be having a very long and strange dream. Qin Sanku recoiled from the man in shock and couldn't believe that the man in front of him had just come back from the dead. A young woman, a child and an elderly man ran up to him. The girl was happy with tears in her eyes that her beloved was alive, and the elderly man said that he had already thought that his son had died and went to the other world. The boy happily called him daddy. Qin Feng smiled in relief as he wiped the sweat from his forehead. He turned to the people, saying that no one had originally said that they were dead. The swamp miasma was an extremely poisonous plant. But if the poisoned person takes the medicine in time, the chewed peel of the Tianluo fruit, then the effect of poisoning can be easily eliminated. So Qin Feng asked Sanku to go to their family's manor and bring Tianluo fruit. It was just that in this era, Qin Feng was the only one who knew about such medicines. Qin Feng walked over to the awakened man with a charming smile and put his hand on his shoulder, asking if the man could tell him what he remembered before he lost consciousness. The man did not immediately understand and asked about the loss of consciousness, and then put his hand forward and pointed in Lin Lan's direction, saying that it was he who blew up the entrance to the cave and forcibly locked up the poor hard workers here. He also added that Lin Lang was afraid that even so, they would be able to escape, so he brought the swamp miasma here. He wanted to poison them, and he wanted them dead. One by one, the other people began to regain their consciousness and confirm the man's words, pointing their fingers at Lin Lan and saying that it was really his fault. Qin Feng smiled triumphantly once again, looking down at Lin Lang and saying that he didn't expect Lin Lang to be behind all this. How could he? What a pity that such a truth came out. He turned to the family members and added that if anyone is angry that their loved ones almost died, they can express all their grievances to Lin Lan right now. The crowd immediately armed themselves with weapons and surrounded the man along with the elderly man accompanying him, and Lin Lang fell to the ground. He stared at them in horror and asked them what they were going to do with him anyway. A loud cry rang out from the depths of the mines. Inside the mine, Qin Feng carefully examined the cave inside. It didn't make any sense. He was looking for something, and it definitely had to be here somewhere. Strange, why couldn't he find it? Qin Feng scratched the top of his head, puzzled. Qin Sanku looked at the young master in disbelief. According to the memories from his past life, the mysterious Lin Lan iron ore that he was looking for should have been hidden in one of the pieces of ordinary ore. Suddenly, the man who had woken up first came up behind Qin Feng, clapped him on the shoulder, and thanked him for saving their lives. The entire family of miners knelt before him. They all addressed Master Qin Feng in unison and said that they would never forget the virtuous and benevolent attitude he had shown. A huge crowd of people knelt in front of him, hands outstretched in a gesture of gratitude. Qin Feng smiled good-naturedly at the guys in front of him and replied that there was nothing wrong with that and no need to thank them. Besides, everyone was tired today, so he would give this mine workers a couple of days off. And after a good rest, they will start working again. How can they do that? Qin Feng thought about the fact that in his previous life, it seemed that no one in the city recognized him. The workers happily replied that yes, they swore to Master Qin Feng that from now on, any order he gave them would be obeyed. Qin Feng turned to the man with the beard and asked where that scoundrel Lin Lang had gone, and the man replied that it seems that after he exposed the attempt on their lives, they surrounded him, but he managed to escape. Maybe he doesn't belong in the city anymore. The man was distraught when he remembered how he had grabbed Lin Lan and tried to kiss him, while Lin Lan was trying to pull away in terror with tears in his eyes. Qin Feng didn't immediately understand what had happened to him and why he looked so dejected. Lin Lang must have hidden the miraculous ore beforehand. If he had known that he would run away, he would have at least tried to pry out information about the location of the ore from him. Qin Feng and Qin Sangku walked out of the cave. Qin Sangku held the young master's horse and asked that since they had finished their business, shouldn't it be time to go back? Qin Feng saddled his horse and spoke to the youth. He asked if the guy knew the Moneylenders of Uni City and if they were not scary people. Sangku chuckled and said that yes, he knew who they were. The Moneylenders in their city are terrifying even to those who don't contact them. If you borrowed money from them and did not return it on time, you risk being disabled for life. They were huge guys with no less huge weapons at the ready. It was almost impossible to repay the debt because the interest rate was too high. Qin Sangku looked restless. He added that only desperate fools would ask them to lend money. Sangku clarified why the young master was asking about this and did he really borrow money from them. Qin Feng replied that yes, he borrowed 500 gold from them. The man who accompanied him smiled and said, "Does Qin Feng really want to take him to the grave with him?" He specifically asked if he was joking. Qin Feng laughed back and said no, and he was actually serious. There was a dead silence between them after the giggles. It didn't last long. Qin Sangku immediately exclaimed in horror and said that an ordinary person only needs 20 gold per year for a quiet and good life, and he borrowed 500 gold from them. Qin Feng scratched the back of his head with an awkward smile and said that of course, where would he offer to get money from to take care of the medical garden so well? Sangku exclaimed that this was the end, and their medical garden had at most 100 gold pieces, so how could they repay the debt in this situation? Qin Feng thought about it and scratched his chin. Initially, he thought that if he took all the iron ore, plus finding the wonderful Xuanfeng ore, he would be able to repay the debt. But now the situation is that Lin Lang has run away, and he still hasn't found the miraculous ore, so where can he get the money now? Qin Sangku continued to exclaim that everything is fine, and the only thing left is to sell the medical garden, and without the medical garden, the whole family will perish. Nearby, someone overheard their conversation, but did not interfere. Suddenly, a voice came from behind Qin Feng. It was Qin Wanli, Qin Feng's father and a guard of Yubing City. He was a large man with a long beard and long hair, and he had a radiant smile on his face. He happily told him how many days they had not seen each other, and as if he had met a completely different person in front of him, he didn't even recognize him right away. He also added whether he felt better already. Qin Sangku wanted to say something to the man in front of him about what his son had done, but Qin Feng managed to shut him up in time, interrupting him and asking his father how long he had been back. In a slightly lower whisper, he told Sangku separately so that he wouldn't say anything unnecessary. In his previous life, his father had always gone out of his way to take good care of him, literally risking his own health. In this life, he would never let his father worry about Qin Feng again. He didn't want his father to suffer for him again. Qin Wanli walked up to his son and asked if his body was fine, and that he didn't have to worry now that he had spent a lot of money and bought him body-tempering pills. Qin Feng's father handed him a box of yellow pills. He said that with their help, Qin Feng would definitely be able to restore his cultivation base. Qin Feng immediately made excuses with an awkward smile and said that his body was already much better than before, and his father didn't need to worry about him at all. Qin Feng thought about how his father had apparently been worried about his injury all along, and for these 2 pills, his father had gone out of his way to get them and done such a great job. Qin Wanli grabbed his arm. He frowned seriously and asked, how did his cultivation base grow to the highest stage of Kai and blood? Qin Feng smiled awkwardly and told his father to calm down a bit first, and Qin Feng would tell him everything after they got back home. After arriving back at the residence, the 2 men were sitting at a table and chatting. Outside the window, 2 small birds were perched on the branches of trees. Qin Wanli was saying that what Qin Feng meant was that he found a teacher who helped him, and what's more, he would teach him alchemy. Qin Wanli smiled happily and pointed his finger at his son, asking about how his son, Qin Feng, would really become an alchemist. Qin Feng confirmed and said that of course, because his teacher said that he was his most talented student. Qin Wanli laughed out loud while covering his eyes. He said that he had always suspected that his son was a genius from heaven, and no one would be able to ruin his son's future. He added and asked where exactly his teacher lives, because he really wants to meet him. Qin Feng scratched his head and replied that his master didn't like outsiders, and he clearly didn't want too many people to know about his existence. He added that the teacher would probably refuse to see him. Qin Wanli scratched his chin thoughtfully and agreed, saying that yes, experts of this level usually preferred to live in seclusion. It might be wrong to lie to his father, but Qin Feng didn't know any better excuse for his sudden knowledge of alchemy. It's better to make up the teacher so that his father doesn't have to worry. Qin Wanli gave up and waved it off, saying that it was already time for him to leave. He took out a small statue from his bosom and handed it to Qin Feng. The man told Qin Feng to keep this item, because he had taken this item especially for him. And if in the future he finds himself in a difficult situation that is difficult to resolve himself, then he can take advantage of it. Qin Feng stared at the outstretched statue. It was a golden oblong object wrapped with the image of a dragon. It had the inscription Qin written on the bottom. This was the Qin family's battle order. Did his father really give him such an important thing? Qin Wanli and Qin Feng went outside. Qin Wanli said with a smile on his face that even though they hadn't seen each other for a long time, he had some business to attend to and their family would be introduced to Qin Feng. Qin Feng agreed and told his father not to worry because he was an adult and understood everything. Qin Wanli stroked the youth's head, ruffling his hair with his big hand. He was holding a statue entrusted to him by his father. This Qin family battle order is really very important, so why did his father just give it to him? It was a great honor, and he promised himself that he would never, ever let his father down. A few days later, in the medical garden, the sky was clear, with birds flying through it and greenery blooming everywhere. Someone was calling for the young master. It turned out to be Qin Senghu, who ran into Qin Feng's room and started talking about how someone came and wanted to see him urgently. Qin Feng held his head and looked confused. He didn't expect that someone would arrive so soon. Qin Feng jumped up and told Senghu to alert all the guards of the medical garden and put them on alert. Qin Senghu immediately agreed and went to carry out the order. Qin Feng went outside. This was the end. It had completely slipped his mind that today was the day to pay off his debts to the loan sharks. Yesterday, he wanted to borrow money from his father, but his father spent all the money on body-tempering pills, and all the family's supplies were used up. Everyone looked flustered, and the guards bowed to the young master. Someone started knocking furiously on the gate. Qin Feng knew that if he didn't pay back the debt, the loan sharks might take his house. Qin Feng ordered the guards protecting the entrance to open it. He was ready to fight to the death. He closed his eyes for a moment before Senghu called out to him. He pointed a finger at the person in front of him. It was a girl with short blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail. She had blue eyes and was wearing a normal work uniform. They couldn't believe it was a pawnbroker. The girl greeted the people in front of her and introduced herself as an Heachin, and she came to thank them for saving their lives. Are there really such great collectors in the world? The girl was asked if she was not a loan shark and did not come to collect debts. And Heachin looked down and said that no, she was a miner and they saved her yesterday, and she came here for her future husband. Qin Feng smiled a little awkwardly, blushing slightly at her words. After the statements that she came for her future husband, everything fell into place. He remembered. She was the only girl that he fed Tianluo fruit mouth to mouth. At the time, he didn't even pay attention to the fact that he unintentionally took advantage of her defenselessness. Qin Feng remembered bending over the girl as he passed the contents of her mouth. Qin Feng waved away the workers frozen by the girl and ordered them to leave, and it was just the two of them. Qin Feng clarified, so she was here to repay them for their kindness. After all, she herself said that she came for this, and how was she going to pay for it anyway? Wu Qin Feng, he didn't intend to get married so early. And Heachin beamed and replied that yes, that's right, and as her gratitude, she would tell them exactly where the miraculous ore was hidden. Qin Feng didn't expect this. How did she know where she was? And wasn't she unconscious at the time? How did she even know that Qin Feng was looking for a miracle ore? And Heachin remembered lying on the ground while two men were digging in the ground nearby, causing a blue light to spread through the cave. She said that she didn't actually immediately lose consciousness at that moment. She took a homemade detox pill and was conscious longer than the others. And just then, she heard about the location of Lin Lan's miraculous ore. Qin Feng was overjoyed by her words and grabbed the girl's hand that was holding her homemade pill. He interrupted her with a smile on his face and said that what was more important was how she made this pill. He couldn't believe that she had prepared a detox pill herself without proper knowledge. And Heachin was slightly taken aback and hesitated before answering, saying that she had learned all this through reading books. Qin Feng was delighted and once again clarified that she really made it herself. This pill might have a few flaws, but the fact that she had concocted it without a teacher was unbelievable. This girl definitely had the talent to become an alchemist. Qin Feng got straight to the point and directly asked about whether she wanted to become an alchemist. The girl didn't immediately know what to say. She said that she had a poor family and still had to support her parents, so she had to work as an honest miner. Qin Feng patted his chest with a happy smile and told her to leave the care of her parents to him. Plus he knows alchemy, so he can take her as his disciple. She just needed to promise that she would follow him. And Heachin was a little taken aback by the sudden suggestion. In his previous life, he had focused on alchemy, But in this life, Qin Feng wanted to practice martial arts as well, so he would be able to kill two birds with one stone if he took her as his disciple. Leave the care of your parents to me. Part-time job benefits. I can take you on as an apprentice. Part-time entrance training. You just need to follow me. Loyal employees who will always work only for you. Summary: an unscrupulous cheater. Qin Feng smiled slyly and rubbed his hands together. He will hire a student to give him more time to practice martial arts. And Heiachin understood his words a little differently. Leave the care of your parents to me. From now on, we will be one family. I can take you as a disciple. Improving the art of alchemy together equals a sweet couple. You just need to follow me. Marry me. The girl gasped. Her cheeks immediately flushed red and she blushed. Short description: did he really want to take her as his wife? This is what was going on in Heiachin's head and how she interpreted everything. The girl stuttered her agreement and said that of course she would follow him everywhere. Qin Feng turned around and laughed out loud, putting his hands behind his back and telling her that she would have to work hard. In his mind, he only thought that he had found a good slave. The girl trailed behind and only sighed, thinking that she had finally found a good husband. A few days later, Mount Fengeming. There were several horse carts parked near the settlement. Qin Sangku was running after Qin Feng and was talking about someone who didn't even expect to come up with the idea of selling iron ore in Fengeming. And how much exactly did he want to sell? Qin Feng walked in front and replied that he needed to sell so much that he could safely pay off the loan sharks, so it was necessary not to overdo it too much with the amount. He held up a finger and said that it was necessary to sell the ores for a specific amount. Sangku and the guards accompanying them asked if he meant 1,030 gold pieces. Qin Sangku pondered and reasoned that even though it was a bit much, they had gathered enough ore and just needed to get rid of it. As soon as they get rid of their debts, they will be able to replenish the ore. If they find some buyer who desperately needs the ore, then they may be able to quickly collect the 1,000 gold they need. Qin Feng interrupted him, saying no, and the amount was actually much higher. In total, they needed to sell ores worth 10,000 gold. Qin Feng had relied too much on Lin Lang's miraculous ore, even though he had delayed the repayment date for the loan sharks, but now he owed them at least 10,000 gold. Qin Feng held the paper out in front of Sangku with a nervous smile, pointing at it with his finger. Qin Sangku was immediately shocked, unable to believe his eyes. 10,000 gold pieces was too much. No one would want to buy a miraculous ore for 10,000 gold. They were definitely doomed. They basically had a maximum of 1,000 gold pieces worth of ore, and where would they get that much money from? Qin Feng replied to tell them not to worry, and besides, was there anything in this world that couldn't be sold? Qin Feng held up a finger and told them to just believe him. On this batch of iron ore, he and Heiachin worked hard for several days, improving the quality beyond recognition. Qin Feng expected that all the ore would be sorted out in a matter of seconds, but they were in too much of a hurry, so they couldn't reach the level of quality they were aiming for. Qin Feng rubbed his chin with a smile on his face. Someone interrupted their conversation and asked how much 10,000 gold they could talk about, because he wouldn't give 100 gold pieces for his wonderful ore, because it's a pity to spend such money on it. Qin Feng's temper immediately disappeared, and he was petrified by such cruel words like a statue. The person who told him this was the shop assistant, Huisheng Feng, the largest shopping mall in Fengeming City. With a self-made smile, the salesman held out a piece of ore in the palm of his hand to Qin Feng's face and said that as everyone around him knows, the miraculous iron ore is crystal clear and has the shape of a gemstone. Did Qin Feng want to say that this boulder in his hand was like a precious stone? Did he take the customers for uncomprehending 3-year-olds? Qin Feng smiled nervously and waved away the brute, saying that he obviously didn't understand anything. After all, this was truly a wonderful ore. The man responded by viciously shouting out that how could Qin Feng consider something that understood ore better than him? In the man's opinion, even if his pebbles turned out to be miraculous ore, he would bow at Qin Feng's feet directly upside down. Qin Feng agreed and said that he took the man at his word. The man in response was indignant and said that let him try to convince him that this is really a real wonderful ore. Their argument was interrupted by a man saying that Huisheng is a place for trading. The person who interrupted them was an obese man. It was shop owner Huisheng Treasurer Gao. The man looked menacing, his eyes were set, a beard grew on his face, and a wart flaunted on the right side of his cheek under the eye. Treasurer Gao asked what the commotion was about. The man who was arguing with Qin Feng held a piece of ore in his hand and poked it with his finger, saying that this fool Qin Feng wanted to sell them a fake miracle ore and said that if he didn't buy anything from him, Qin Feng would forcibly sell it to him. Treasurer Gao didn't pay much attention to their conversation. He just threw the two men out of the door and told them to get the hell out of here because his Huisheng store doesn't accept fakes. The men were not deterred by the fact that they had just been kicked out of the store and continued their argument outside. Qin Feng intended to cut up his abuser with a 40cm knife taken from the guard. He was indignant at how he dared to say that his miraculous iron ore was fake. It infuriated Qin Feng beyond belief. Qin Sanku barely tried to restrain the young master, telling him that there was no need to do this. Treasurer Gao was a respected man, and it is supported by powerful people. They couldn't risk it and allow themselves to provoke him. Qin Feng calmed down immediately, exhaling deeply. He understood that Sanku was right. Treasurer Gao's power were not inferior to that of their own Qin family. But because of him, they were forced to leave Fengeming and go to another city. He was worried that during this trip, Qin Feng would be delaying his debt payment again. Qin Sanku only exhaled calmly, wiping his forehead and noticing how energetic Qin Feng was after all. Treasurer Gao was talking to the same salesman, saying that if he encountered such scammers again, he'd better expel them right away. Quarrels and proceedings with such people will only spoil the reputation of his store. The man flaunted him and said that he would definitely learn this lesson. Treasurer Gao noticed the ore lying on the table. He asked why he put the coal on the counter because it was incredibly dirty. The man waved it off and replied that it must be that liar Qin Feng's miraculous ore that he had apparently forgotten. Treasurer Gao asked if there was an ore mine nearby, and the man said yes, and it was just ordinary iron ore. A piece of iron, in other words. And this charlatan wanted to sell him this ore for 10,000 gold, but he attacked the wrong person. He wasn't stupid, so he didn't fall for such a trick. Treasurer Gao, his face expressionless, told him that he was doing a great job picking up a piece of ore. He was looking at her intently when suddenly a blue light spilled out of the ore, blinding them both. Treasurer Gao was immediately taken aback. The man laughed and asked why all of a sudden this ore was shining so brightly. Did Qin Feng think to put a flashlight in it? How many years he had worked in the trade, but among all the ores he had seen, this was the first time he had ever heard of the glow of a miraculous ore. He continued to call Qin Feng a charlatan and a fool, saying that Qin Feng actually thought that they would buy into his deception. Treasurer Gao was silent, and then in the same second, he slammed his fist into the man's jaw. He immediately started yelling at him and saying that this stupid merchant had offended an important person, and because of him, it was all over because now Qin Feng was offended by them. The merchant didn't understand what was going on, holding on to the injured spot and shedding tears. The treasurer has ordered him to prepare the money immediately, and they are going to go before him and apologize to such an important gentleman. The man continued to wail, saying only that he hoped it wasn't too late. With a quick step, he hurried to catch up to Qin Feng before he went too far. Qin Feng, meanwhile, continued on with his escorts. Qin Sanku was asking him if it was true that the young master had met a powerful alchemist instead of just another charlatan. It was just that he couldn't believe that even with the help of a high-level master, they were kicked out in disgrace. They had set such a high price, and he had a feeling that even if they passed a dozen such large stores, they still wouldn't sell for the amount they needed. Qin Feng sighed and replied that he had the feeling that these people were just plain ignorant. He processed the ore too well, and they didn't even realize it. A guard walking behind added that it might be worth lowering the price a bit when you arrive in another city. They will pay back the debt in parts as an option. He added and asked how much gold they thought they could sell the ore for. The obese Treasurer Gao and that salesman were running from afar. The man was waving his arms and shouting for them to wait for them for a bit. Their shop was willing to buy back all their miraculous ore. Qin Feng was surprised and asked again, were they really willing to buy back all of his ore for 10,000 gold? He asked if they were sure they had that kind of money. Treasurer Gao bent down, trying to catch his breath, and replied that of course there is, and he is even willing to buy everything. He added that there was just a misunderstanding between them, for which he humbly apologizes, plus he has already brought the money. Qin Feng smiled and replied that he probably knew about goods. Sanku and the guards were overjoyed, surprised that someone was actually willing to buy all the ore. They couldn't believe their ears when they asked if they had heard everything correctly. Sanku couldn't believe how lucky they were and told the young master to immediately agree to such a deal. However, Qin Feng refused. The men accompanying him immediately lost heart. How come he wasn't willing to sell the ore? Qin Feng added that unfortunately, he really wanted to sell Treasurer Gao the entire batch right now, but there was still one question that bothered him. The treasurer clarified exactly what the issue was and what basically made Qin Feng refuse to sell. Qin Feng continued, saying that his buddy had slightly embarrassed his subordinates. They held a terrible grudge for him, and it was only because of them that Qin Feng didn't want to sell his ore. And if he was ready, they wouldn't let him do it. The guards at the back and Sanku were completely dejected by his words, blaming them for not wanting to sell the ore himself. But it was the first time there was a demand for it. They really wanted to sell the ore, and they didn't hold a grudge against anyone at all. Treasurer Gao immediately ran up to the merchant and grabbed him by the ear, pointing angrily at Qin Feng and telling him that he was a fool and it was all his fault. He had angered Lord Qin Feng and his subordinates, and he had to immediately apologize to them properly. The merchant cringed and replied to the man that he was trying to sell him fake ore, And what was he supposed to apologize for? The treasurer kept yelling angrily at the guy and saying that he still laughed at him for calling his ore fake after all. And the merchant obviously had a problem with his eyesight since he couldn't tell the difference between a fake and the merchant was generally a lousy one. Treasurer Gao added that ordinary miracle ore is crystal clear and shines like a gemstone. This is because ordinary miracle ore has a lot of useless crystals, and they are extremely difficult to remove. This creates the illusion that the miraculous ore is like a gemstone. But in reality, the purer the miracle ore, the darker its color. And as soon as you stimulate it with your aura, it will start to emit light. The higher the quality of the miraculous ore, the more it will glow. Treasurer Gao also dared to add that this ore was the best he had ever seen in his life. Both the merchant and the people accompanying Qin Feng didn't really understand the train of thought as they stared at him with their mouths agape. Black and strange ore was really rare. Treasurer Gao thought that the ore was of an excellent refining level, and from the looks of it, there was an unfathomable and powerful alchemist behind Qin Feng. Qin Feng smiled smugly as he scratched his nose. He thought to himself that now they finally understood what the highest quality ore was. Clearly, he and Heiachin were using the method that Qin Feng had been honing for 100,000 years. But since he realized the value of this ore, he didn't have to blame Qin Feng for asking much more for it now. Qin Feng stammered and started talking about how Treasurer Gao shouldn't have apologized at all. After all, his friend was doing his best for the whole store and only wanted the best. O was so sure that he was right that he even said that if his pebbles turn out to be a wonderful ore, then he will bow down to Qin Feng upside down. Qin Feng smiled viciously, but immediately cooled down. He turned around and a second later said that he didn't really remember what they said to him. Treasurer Gao became even angrier at the poor merchant and clenched his hand into a fist. The poor guy got another punch right in the jaw. He said that since the man had promised to bow upside down, he should answer for his words. A few seconds later, the poor merchant was standing on his head upside down, tears streaming from his eyes. He complained and said that he was treated unfairly. Treasurer Gao didn't pay any attention to his words at all. He turned to Qin Feng and told him not to get mad at his subordinate, even if he had made a mess of it. He offered a bid of 30,000 gold. To which Qin Feng waved his hands and replied with a smile that it was fine, even though he would be in a slight disadvantage due to the fact that he, Treasurer Gao, had kept his good reputation. The treasurer smiled happily and returned his thanks, saying that Qin Feng was very lenient and looked forward to their continued cooperation together. Not far away, Sanku and the guards couldn't believe their ears, 30,000 gold. And on top of that, Qin Feng also said that he would be left in a small negative after that. Here's how to get rich. Mommy, their outlook on life has just been shattered. Qin Feng smiled contentedly at the huge stack of cash in his hands and said that they were rich now. Not only will the debt be repaid, but there will also be a plus to everything. Qin Feng pointed ahead and said that they were going shopping. There are still many things to buy for his martial arts cultivation, and he will finally be able to spend money recklessly. It was night outside. Lin Lang knelt in front of his father and talked about how Qin Feng had cruelly bullied him and he should help him get justice. Because of Qin Feng, he was beaten up and his own son was humiliated. The man on the throne asked again and clarified, did that traitorous Qin Feng dare to frame him? Lin Lang tearfully agreed and said yes, and Qin Feng is currently in Fengeming. He asked his father to help him. The man agreed, saying that what kind of father would sit idly by when his own son was so blatantly framed. Qin Feng wouldn't survive tomorrow, and he would make sure of that. Lin Lang bent down with a malicious smile and wiped away the fake blood. He gloated in his head and thought about how he would become Qin Feng's main witness. The estate of the Qin family. Qin Feng sat in the lotus position and meditated. The pills his father gave him aren't bad enough. Thanks to them and reading the gods, he will be able to ascend to the 5th level of the Kaiyan blood realm. Gradually, he becomes stronger, and he will definitely be able to change the sad fate of his previous life. Suddenly, he heard a commotion. He activated the divine sense. There was someone outside the house, and it was 2 figures. Qin Feng chuckled, because he didn't remember inviting anyone. But if that's the case, he'll just beat them up for fun. He'll also take a look how much his strength has increased. Negotiations were being held outside the house. One of the intruders said that he would distract his attention, and then he would rush in after him and kill him. The second agreed and asked if they could start then. As soon as they drew their weapons, Qin Feng pushed open the door and appeared right in front of them. He greeted them with a smile and asked if they were looking for someone in particular. The infiltrators were surprised to see him. Qin Feng said that he knew of their arrival before they could even enter. They were surprised that Qin Feng had found out about their whereabouts and had come out to meet them. Qin Feng scratched his head and said that yes, of course they were assassins, but he hadn't swung his fists in a long time, so he went out to practice on them. The men laughed. The robed man said that Qin Feng is just a scum at the 5th level of the Kaiyan blood stage and wants to practice on them. The masked man added that they had already killed other people so many times, and this was the first time that their prey had come out to them with open arms. Qin Feng smiled and replied that everything happens for the first time. It was the first time in his life that he was going to fight. Qin Feng thought that since he had devoted all his attention and strength to alchemy in his previous life, he hadn't had to fight anyone for 100,000 years. It was a good time to try out the result of his work. The guys were surprised and laughed that Qin Feng was actually going to fight for the first time. The masked man held up a weapon and said that Qin Feng would pay with his life for this lesson, but the masked man only smiled in response. The masked man ran straight at Qin Feng, but was met with a fist flying towards his face.